Hello students. So today we are looking at the female reproductive cycles, which are made up of the ovarian and the uterine cycles. So we will see how they correlate and correspond, and then we will look at the processes of ovulation, gamete transport, and how fertilization occurs and what are the effects of fertilization. Now you know that at puberty certain hormones begin to be secreted in the body. Now, the hypothalamus secretes gonadotrophin releasing hormones, which will act on the anterior pituitary to release gonadotrophins. What are gonadotrophins? These are FSH or follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone or LH. These hormones are going to stimulate and control the ovarian cycles and ovulation. So, let's see how. Now, the very name FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, means it's going to influence the maturation of the follicles. Now, we've learned the stages of folliculogenesis, remember, from a primordial, primary, secondary, and then a Graafian follicle. So, this is under the influence of FSH. Now, luteinizing hormone means this plays a role in ovulation. So, this in effect makes the Graafian follicle rupture. When LH increases, the Graafian follicle will rupture and the oocyte will be released from the Graafian follicle. And what is left behind will be known as the corpus luteum. So, we will see details of this. So, LH, the word luteinizing hormone means it influences ovulation and then it helps the corpus luteum to develop, right? So the phases of the ovarian cycles can be considered as the follicular phase, where the follicles are maturing. Then in mid-cycle level there is ovulation, and after ovulation there is the luteal phase of the ovarian cycle, where the corpus luteum is formed. Now, you know, this is all happening in the ovary. We have seen a section of the ovary, and recall the primary, secondary, and Graafian follicle. You know the cells, etc., lining it. Now, every month, about 15 to 20 primary follicles under the influence of FSH grow and start maturing, show these changes to become try to become mature follicles, but usually only one out of these becomes a fully mature Graafian follicle, and then that will undergo ovulation, and the oocyte with its surrounding cells will be released. We will see what it is, and what is left behind of that Graafian follicle will form a cellular and vascular structure called the corpus luteum. Then we'll see what happens to it. Finally, if pregnancy does not occur, it will become scar-like, and which is known as corpus albicans. Albicans means fibrous, and then it will disappear, and the whole cycle will start again. Okay, so it's usually 15 to 20 follicles start growing in each ovary, in both the ovaries, but only one Graafian follicle from one of the ovaries will rupture. So it's cyclically, usually it is seen that every month in the monthly cycles, if suppose the right ovary has released the Graafian follicle, in the next month it will be the left ovary. So why this is how this is controlled is not known, but it's very precise. Now, in the follicular phase of the ovarian cycle, as a mature Graafian follicle forms, you know its parts. Recall, these are the granulosa cells. Surrounding them is the theca interna, vascular cells, and the fibrous theca externa. Then the oocyte, the zona pellucida, and then corona radiata and cumulus euphorus cells. Now, these granulosa cells and the theca interna cells start producing estrogen. So it's not only a quiet follicular wall, it starts secreting estrogen. So how is estrogen produced, under which hormone control? So FSH stimulates follicle development, which starts producing estrogen, right? Now, what is estrogen going to do? We will see how it influences the proliferative phase of the endometrial or uterine cycle. In effect, it prepares the lining of the uterus every month for in case pregnancy occurs. So the endometrium or the lining of the uterus must become a nourishing bed to receive an embryo in case pregnancy occurs. You know, pregnancy may or may not occur. Okay. Now, a mature Graafian follicle is formed. It is ready to ovulate. So what is the process of ovulation defined as it is the release of the oocyte from a mature Graafian follicle. Let's see at what stage it is. Now, just before ovulation, under the influence of follicle stimulating and LH, which is starting to be secreted, this secondary follicle becomes the mature Graafian follicle. Okay, a lot of increase in follicular fluid and so on. Now, because of sudden more increase in LH, which is secreted by the anterior pituitary, this causes the first thing that happens is it causes the primary oocyte, which was, remember, arrested in prophase 1 so long. This completes its meiosis 1 and also meiosis 2 begins. And but is not complete, it again gets arrested in metaphase 2 of meiosis 2. See how precise it is. So it becomes a secondary oocyte in arrested in metaphase 2. Okay, now it will remain like that. How is this meiosis 1 complete and meiosis 2 is initiated by a maturation promotion factor? This is again a protein produced by the follicular cells themselves, and this happens approximately 3 hours before ovulation. Hence, what does a mature Graafian follicle contain? It contains a secondary oocyte arrested in metaphase 2 now. Okay, now here you can see a picture of ovulation. So firstly, what happens? The surface of the ovary starts showing a bulge that is known as a stigma. Okay, imagine this like just like bulging without this. And then there are local digestive enzymes produced by ovarian stroma, for example, collagenase and some prostaglandins. Again, this is under because all this happens why? Because of sudden LH increase. This also LH also stimulates the contractions in the ovary, and because by increasing these prostaglandin levels, and then there is a sudden like a volcano erupting. You can see the follicle is bursting, the follicular fluid is gushing out and throwing out the secondary oocyte surrounded by some of its cells. So what are the cells surrounding it? So corona radiata and some of the cumulus oophorus cells are released. You can see the arrow there. Okay, now, as I said, 15 to 20 follicles may rupture, but only one reaches Graafian follicle stage, and hence only one oocyte is discharged at ovulation. We shall be looking at multiple pregnancies or twin pregnancies in a separate place, so then you'll understand more. But usually, it's only one oocyte is discharged at ovulation, and it is surrounded, as I said, by all these cells shown in the figure. See the circle cells? So it's oocyte, zona pellucida, then the corona radiata, and some of the cumulus oophorus cells will be released. Okay, remember it's a secondary oocyte arrested in metaphase 2. So finally, to summarize, what is the role of LH at ovulation? It's called an LH surge. Surge means sudden increase. Causes firstly the Graafian follicle to become completely mature. The pressure inside the follicular fluid will increase. Okay, by increasing the concentrations of maturation promoting factor. As I said, this first causes the primary oocyte to complete meiosis 1 to form a secondary oocyte, and which starts meiosis 2 but gets arrested in metaphase 2. Okay, also because of the pressure increased follicular fluid, it causes the follicular rupture and ovulation to happen, so release of the oocyte with its surrounding cells. And thirdly, it whatever is left behind of the Graafian follicle then is made up of a mass of cells, right? It is made up of granulosa cells, the theca interna and the externa. So now what happens is it stimulates the production of corpus, the formation of corpus luteum. That's why it's called a luteinizing hormone. Means that cellular mass will proliferate, all the fluid is gone out, and the space will be taken up by completely covered, replaced by cells which have grown in the granulosa and the theca interna. So it becomes a very highly cellular vascular structure known as corpus luteum. Okay, and this corpus luteum will be a great source of progesterone. Okay, so let's see why progesterone is necessary later on. Now, before we go further, then what are some clinical signs of ovulation where a woman can understand that she may be ovulating? So certain things happen, body changes. Sometimes during ovulation, some women feel a slight abdominal pain. It's called Mittelschmerz, means mid-cycle pain, because it happens in the middle of the cycle. Okay. Then ovulation is usually accompanied by a rise in basal body temperature. So this can be monitored. If someone is trying to get pregnant, you can monitor the basal body temperature in the morning, and it just shows 1 or 2 degrees rise. Okay. Thinning of cervical mucus secretions. So because in preparation for fertilization to happen, then the cervical mucus might get stringy and thinner. Now, sometimes in some women, you can understand if there is hormonal imbalance, they might say low FSH or LH, ovulation may be difficult. In these cases, some drugs to stimulate ovulation and stimulate by increasing gonadotrophin release. So this can help ovulation. Okay, and but sometimes these drugs often lead to multiple ovulations, so likelihood of multiple pregnancies is higher if they are on such ovulation stimulation drugs. So now remember we said the phases of the ovarian cycle were the follicular phase, ovulation mid-cycle, and the luteal phase, that is the formation of corpus luteum. So let's look at more little bit of what is the corpus luteum. Now, as I said, after this follicle has ruptured, the granulosa cell layer and the theca interna cells layer in the wall of this ruptured follicle will proliferate, and they get more vascular. Sorry, this side, they get more vascular and form a cellular mass known as the corpus luteum. All this is happening under the influence of LH. Now, why is it called luteum? Because the cells are going to produce progesterone, which is a cholesterol based compound. So a lot of fat accumulates, lipid substances accumulate in the cells of this corpus luteum, which have a yellowish pigment. So it's called, that's why they are called, lutein means yellow. So lutein cells, and the structure is called corpus luteum. And these, as I said, start secreting large amounts of progesterone. Some estrogen continues to be secreted. Okay. Now will this progesterone, how will it affect? It will again act on the uterine mucosa or endometrium, which will enter the secretory phase of the endometrial cycle in preparation for implantation of the embryo. So let us see what is happening now in the uterus. So far we were seeing about the ovarian cycle. So before we see the endometrial or uterine cycle, which is under the influence of these hormones, let's review the structure of the endometrium, because I don't know whether you've done it in histology, Reproductive yet. So if you take a section of the wall of the uterus, you can see the upper part layer is known as endometrium, which is the inner lining of the uterus, then the myometrium or the muscle layer, and the perimetrium, which consists of connective tissue and visceral peritoneum where applicable. Okay. Now in the endometrium, you can again identify two zones. One is called the basal portion, basal layer or stratum basale of the endometrium, and this is known as the functional layer or stratum functional of the endometrium. Now, what is the endometrium made up of? So you can see surface epithelium, which is simple columnar, and this is invaginating to form the uterine glands. These uterine glands even branch at the bottom, as you can see in the second picture. Then, besides the uterine glands, which invaginate down in the connective tissue stroma, this pink background is all stromal cells or connective tissue. Then besides glands, you've got a lot of blood vessels. Now blood vessels enter from outside, and then you can see as they travel in the endometrium, they are very spiral, tortuous. These are known as spiral arteries. Okay, and then they become little more straighter when they reach the top. You can see they will reach right up to the surface epithelium. Okay, now why are they spiral? Because if pregnancy occurs, the uterus will increase in size almost up to the epigastrium with a you know how much a full term baby weighs and is what size. So then these arteries must be able to stretch, so they're already tortuous, so that they won't tear when the uterus increases in size. So see nature's wonder. Now this endometrial cycle then consists of three phases: the proliferative phase, where endometrium is growing; the secretory phase, where it is maximum thickness and secreting, and etc., and then the menstrual phase where it is being shed off. Or you can start with the menstrual phase. See here, it is very thin. The upper endometrium is shed off, and then it grows again, then thickest, then again shed, then again growing. So this cycle goes on, which is another influence of hormones. Let's see how. Now remember what is in the menstrual phase. When a woman is passing so-called blood through the female reproductive tract for 3 to 5 days, actually is what? It is the functional layer of endometrium that is being shed off. The basal layer stays the same, or here this is the basal layer in the other picture. It will not, it remains constant, and what is shed off every month is this functional layer of endometrium consisting of glands and secretions, upper part, blood vessels which are torn off, and naturally blood will leak, and this connective tissue. So it's nothing but endometrial lining. Why does the basal not shed? Because it must regrow, it must provide a base for everything to again grow. So now let's see how the ovarian and the uterine or endometrial cycles are connected to each other or influence each other. So again, go back here, FSH and LH secreted by the anterior pituitary. FSH stimulates the follicular phase, that means Graafian follicle is formed. Now Graafian follicle secretes estrogen. Now what does estrogen do? It circulates in blood, and now it's going to influence or control the proliferative phase of the endometrial cycle. You see, it will help the endometrium regrow, the functional layer grow. That means the stroma, the epithelium will regenerate, glands will regenerate, the blood vessels start growing, but they still don't reach the top. Okay. So the proliferative phase of the uterine cycle corresponds to the follicular phase of the ovarian cycle and vice versa. And then mid-cycle, you can see ovulation happens under the influence of LH. Now, LH stimulates the development of the corpus luteum, which starts secreting large amounts of progesterone. Now, what does progesterone do? Progesterone makes the endometrial lining enter the secretory phase. So, this was proliferative phase under the influence of estrogen. Now, this is the secretory phase. What happens in the secretory phase? That you can see the endometrium is maximum thickness, and the blood vessels are going to go right up to the top. The glands become tortuous, full of secretions. The stromal cells will swell up, become full of liquid. In other words, it's like a nourishing bed is going to be formed in case fertilization occurs. So which phase of the ovarian cycle corresponds to the secretory phase? It's the luteal phase, which secretes progesterone, which makes the endometrium enter the secretory phase. Okay. So what are the changes in the secretory phase of the endometrial cycle? You can see glands have become tortuous, the arteries have reached the top, and the endometrium becomes maximum thickness in size. Okay. Now, if pregnancy occurs, you remember now corpus luteum has formed in the ovary, which is producing progesterone. Okay. Now, this ovulated oocyte, suppose, has been fertilized and pregnancy occurs. So the zygote will divide and all, and then the embryo will come back into the uterine cavity to get implanted in the endometrium. So endometrium hence needs to be very thick so that the early nourishment of that embryo can happen, that implanted embryo, right? Now, if pregnancy occurs, then this corpus luteum continues to secrete progesterone, which is very necessary for the to maintain the endometrium in this secretory phase, maximum thickness. It can't be shed off, right? Because the embryo must implant in it. So this corpus luteum then becomes persists, becomes more vascular, again equally cellular, continues to secrete large amounts of progesterone and some estrogens, and hence is known as corpus luteum of pregnancy. Okay, so it continues to secrete until when? Until within the embryonic tissues, the placenta will develop from embryonic and maternal tissues and will take over the nourishment. Then only it will degenerate. So this takes about 2 to 3 months, and by the time the placenta can take over. Okay. Now, if pregnancy does not occur, what happens? This oocyte is lost, and this corpus luteum then, the corpus luteum starts shrinking because now no need of so much progesterone, right? So it starts shrinking and becomes scar-like, and that is known as corpus albicans, scar-like tissue, and it will disappear in the ovarian stroma. And because it's decreasing in size and reducing, progesterone secretion decreases, so the endometrial lining can no longer be maintained so thick, it starts shedding off, and then you get the menstrual phase. Then again, proliferative, and so on. It goes on. Okay, so this is how the two cycles are correlated. Now, this you know already, but just like a recap. So, once ovulation occurs, how is the oocyte transported in the tube? So, you know the lining of the tube is simple ciliated columnar epithelium. The fimbria first will trap the oocyte. Remember, it's a secondary oocyte in metaphase 2. And then after that, the cilia push it along. The uterine tube smooth muscle itself begins to contract. Okay. Remember, the oocyte is also surrounded by those cumulus uforus and all those corona radiata cells. They are part of granulosa, so it's saying granulosa, but remember specifically they are corona radiata. Okay, and cumulus uforus cells. And by the motion of cilia, it's carried to the ampulla, and so all these factors again regulated also by his hormones. And then if fertilization occurs, then the zygote starts moving back into the uterine cavity for implantation. Okay. So let's now see the interesting process of fertilization. I will also put up a video link so that you can watch an animated version of the same. Now this is a beautiful picture you can see of an oocyte surrounded by its corona radiata and some cumulus forest cells. This is the wall of the fallopian tube. You can see cilia, it looks like a jungle, and these are the many sperms trying to fertilize. So what is fertilization? It's defined as the process by which male and female gametes fuse. That means an oocyte and a sperm fuse, and it occurs in the ampulla. Okay. Now, you know the sperm count, but it's actually only about 1% of the sperms deposited in the vagina or in the female reproductive tract will enter the cervix where they can survive. But again, as they go up, they have to have tremendous motility, right? And then they have to go into the ampulla of the tube to be able to fertilize and oocyte if it exists there. So of course they're highly motile, but muscular contractions of the uterus also, and secretions also help the sperm transport. So usually about sperm count is 300 to 600 million uh, per ejaculate, that means per 3 ml. So let's say 300 to 600 or 300 400 are deposited, million are deposited in the female reproductive tract. So you can see how many, but only 300 to 500, that means only 1% reach the site of fertilization. So majority are lost in the acidic environment of the female reproductive tract. And out of those 500 or so reaching, only one gets to fertilize the egg. Egg means the oocyte. So imagine how all are mostly destroyed. And but the others, so whichever sperm reaches first will get to penetrate the oocyte, but the others will be arrested wherever they are. But it's not like then okay they die out immediately, or they are okay, you go, we are doing nothing now. What they will do is they will help the sperm that has reached victory, that has won the race, by trying to digest these cells to create a passage for that sperm. So there's a terrific team spirit, and it really is an obstacle race for them. Now let's understand what is capacitation, because only capacitated sperms can pass through these corona cells and penetrate the zona, etc. Okay. So the first change to occur, there must be some changes that first occur in the female reproductive tract even before the sperm reaches the site of fertilization. Okay. So what must they do? They must undergo a process called capacitation, which is like a period of conditioning in the female genital tract, can last up to about 7 hours, where they are, because of their passage through the male genital tract, they've been coated with glycoprotein coat and seminal plasma proteins, etc., from the seminal vesicle. So these have to be removed first. So these are removed from the coverings, I mean, over the sperms by lysosomal digestive enzymes secreted in the uterine or cervical mucosa. Okay. Once this protein coat is dissolved, then that sperm is said to be capacitated. So only capacitated sperms can pass through the corona and further fertilize. Okay, can fertilize the oocyte. So let's understand what these terms are. Now, remember, capacitation has occurred in the female genital tract. Now let's look at the process of fertilization in phases. So now this is happening in the ampulla of the uterine tube. Capacitated sperms have reached the site of fertilization. So what is phase 1 of fertilization? What happens in phase 1 is the acrosome reaction, which is simply penetration of all those cells, the corona radiata and the cumulus oophorus cells, which surround the oocyte, have to be first penetrated by the sperm. So you can see this sperm coming in stages and reaching. So actually imagine many sperms are doing this. They try to penetrate these cells. How? By, you remember, the head of the sperm was covered by an acrosome cap when you studied the structure of the sperm. So which contains these, again, these digestive enzymes called acrosin and trypsin like substances, which are released from this cap. See here, you can see it's being released, and these digest these cells, and they will also help to penetrate the zona. Now in this picture, this is the zona pellucida, and then here you can see the slight gap, and then this is the cytoplasmic membrane of the oocyte itself. So they must pass through cells, zona, the space, then the cytoplasmic membrane of the um, oocyte. So how is all this possible? By these digestive enzymes. Now if one sperm is fast, it has gone ahead, the other sperm still try to help by digesting a path. Here you can see many sperms lying there. Now what is phase 2? Phase 2 is this sperm now has penetrated the corona radiata cells, okay, by continued acrosome reaction. Now it penetrates the zona, which is a thick hard membrane. It will pass through the zona again by the same acrosin enzymes will help it to penetrate the zona. But in this phase 2, something happens that is known as the zona reaction now. So what is zona reaction? Here you can see in this image, the sperm has penetrated the zona and its head has touched this cytoplasmic membrane. Now the minute the head, rather the second it touches, you can see some bluish granules being released by the cytoplasmic membrane of the oocyte. These are known as cortical granules. Okay, these again release some lysosomal enzymes from these cortical granules into the space, extracellular space, as you can see, and this will change the chemical composition of the zona. And then once the chemical composition of the zona changes, this zona becomes impermeable to the other sperms. That means if one has reached the cytoplasmic membrane, the others, wherever they are, they will be stuck. Okay, now this is an example where this has reached. So cortical granules are released from the cytoplasmic membrane here, and that will affect the permeability of the zone. So this is known as the zona reaction. Now other sperms may have be found anywhere, but they will be stuck as if frozen there. And what is the result, or why does the zona reaction occur? It is to prevent polyspermy, because there are so many sperms all want to enter, but only one must enter. So others are prevented by this zona uh, reaction. Okay. Now phase 3 is when the sperm has now penetrated all these obstacles, the cells, then the zona, then the cytoplasmic membrane. Now it's inside the oocyte. Then phase 3 means the fusion of oocyte here. This is the oocyte and the sperm cytoplasmic membranes. It is trying to enter. Okay. So the plasma membranes of the sperm and egg fuse, and in the humans, what happens? You can see the head, that is the nuclear material, and part of the tail enter the oocyte. But it's whatever little cytoplasm was surrounding the tail, okay, and the head like this is remains stuck, is left behind on the oocyte surface. So when the minute these plasma membranes fuse, this happens. The others, see, are stuck wherever they were. Okay. Now, as soon as the sperm enters the oocyte, the oocyte, what happens to the oocyte? It responds in three ways. First is zona reactions occur so that polyspermy is prevented. Second, remember it was secondary oocyte arrested in metaphase 2, right? Metaphase of meiotic 2. Now, this resumes dividing, and remember oogenesis, the last stage was a mature ovum and a second polar body. So polar body is here at the edge. Now it becomes a mature ovum once the sperm is inside here, see? And a second polar body that will be lost. Sometimes they divide and then it's lost, right? And third thing that happens is immediately formation of the male, female, and the male pronucleus. So head of the sperm, once it's inside, it will now become rounded, containing the genetic material. The tail is lost, so head formation of male and female pronuclei, and the chromosomes rearrange themselves within the that pronucleus of the sperm. Okay, now let's see what happens further. So after it penetrates the oocyte, what is the fate? Remember we said its cytoplasmic membrane is lost. Its nucleus becomes swollen to form the male pronucleus. Tail will detach and degenerate, and these now come close together in contact and lose their nuclear envelope. So here you can see the chromosomes derived from the male and the female. Okay, and the they lose their nuclear envelopes and it becomes like one, and then you get the chromosomes in the center equator, then they start separating out, and you can see cytoplasmic division also. So point is, you get a diploid zygote first, means each one had haploid amount of chromosomes and haploid amount of DNA, right? So the normal diploid amount is restored, and this zygote soon starts uh, showing cytoplasmic division and starts to undergo mitotic divisions, which is known as cleavage. This marks the end of fertilization. Okay, so what are the end results of fertilization? So remember, the story of fertilization began actually before birth in oogenesis, right? And oogenesis then begins before birth and is complete only at fertilization. Now, what are the results or effects of fertilization? Firstly, formation of the mature ovum by completing its second meiotic division once the sperm enters the oocyte. Then formation of a single cell called the zygote. Restoration of the diploid number of chromosomes, half coming from mother, half from the father, and then hence the zygote contains a new combination of chromosomes which are actually slightly different from the parents because of genetic recombination. You know that during meiosis and those all the phases, right? Prophase, metaphase, there is crossover or genetic exchange. That's why the sibling, I mean the offspring, will resemble their parents, but you are still your unique self with different characteristics. So genetic variability because of exchange of genetic material. Okay, these are the effects of fertilization. Some more effects continued. So how is the sex of the genetic sex of the embryo is determined? How? Because a sperm can be X bearing or Y bearing, right? But an oocyte is only X bearing. So if an X carrying sperm, X bearing X chromosome, like 22 plus X sperm, will fertilize with an oocyte, then the result will be a female embryo. If a Y bearing sperm fertilizes, then it will be a embryo. So who determines the sex of the child? Obviously, it's the father, because father can contribute either an X or a Y. Female can contribute only X. So the chromosomal or genetic sex of the embryo is determined at fertilization. And as you can see, this zygote, once it's formed, soon starts dividing mitotically into, so one becomes 2 cell, 2 becomes 4 cell, 4, 8, 16, and so on. So this immediately the zygote starts undergoing cleavage, initiation or beginning of cleavage. Cleavage is mitotic divisions of the zygote. So fertilization is complete only when cleavage is initiated. Okay. Now, if the oocyte that was released in the tube did not get fertilized, then usually it will degenerate. Maximum 24 to 48 hours, 24 hours it will die. Okay. So fertilization is complete when the zygote starts dividing or with initiation of cleavage. So what is cleavage? It's a series of mitotic cell divisions that results in increase in number of cells. These cells are called blastomeres, which will become smaller with each. So as they divide, they become smaller in size. And why, you can see. So this is zygote. You can see the male female pronuclei, and then these will of course fuse and all that, and then cytoplasmic division. It's a two cell stage. Two will become four, 4 will become 8, and then 16. So now you can see why the cell size will become smaller, because they are still surrounded by the rigid zona pellucida. It has not dissolved. So within that, if cells are dividing, then obviously they'll be compacted together and smaller until you get a structure like this. Morula means mulberry. It looks like a mulberry, right? So that is when the cleavage just begins, then fertilization is complete, and this is called, whole thing is called further cleavage. So now you know that clinically sometimes there are couples who are not be able to have children for one reason or the other. So that is known as infertility, and you can see at least 15 to 30% may have this problem worldwide. It's not in any country, for unknown reasons sometimes. So we can understand that male infertility can be a result of what? If the sperm count is low, or they're poorly motile or abnormal structure, as we have seen in spermatogenesis. So what is the normal sperm count we have seen is usually 100 million per ml, or it will be 300 to 600 per 3 ml. Average ejaculate is 3 ml. It might be anywhere between this. But let's take it as per milliliter, so 100 million per millimeter. But men below a sperm count of 20 million per millimeter may have difficulty in, being fertile, so they may be considered infertile or sterile. But nowadays, with good techniques, assisted reproductive techniques, even low sperm count, good sperms can be harvested. Now, female infertility may be due to a number of causes, including the blocked uterine tubes. Then the oocyte cannot travel, to the site, or the sperm cannot reach the site of fertilization. If cervical mucus composition is very highly acidic or infected, that all the sperms die in the tract, or there is some kind of immune complexes which are acting against the spermatozoa. If ovulation cycles are not normal, that means hormones are not being secreted normally, either by the pituitary or by the ovary, and if the oocytes themselves are of abnormal structure. So many factors can come into play, right? Now, what is in vitro fertilization is fertilization outside the body if carried out in the lab. So these are IVF techniques are now very advanced to help such infertile couples. Okay, that is a separate lecture we will see in later stage. So then that brings us to the end of this part. So now remember, we started with gametogenesis, then zygote fertilization, and then now we will carry the story further as the weeks go on. So thank you, and if you have any queries, feel free to post them. Okay.